Good day, everyone. We are your presenters, and the lesson for today is all about primary chords. The primary chords are the three most commonly used chords in music. Lots of songs and many pieces of music that you've already heard are built around them because they work well together. If you are starting to compose your own music, then an understanding of the primary chords is going to give you a big head start. Today's objectives, you are expected to first, determine primary chords in minor and major scale. Second, calculate the chords first, fourth, and fifth in minor and major scale. And lastly, appreciate the importance of primary chords in music. Before we proceed to the definition of primary chord, let us first define what is a chord. A chord is any combination of three or more pitch classes that sound simultaneously, and a three-note chord whose pitch classes can be arranged as a third is called a triad. So what are primary chords? Primary chords are the most commonly used chords in any key. These are the chords first, fourth, and fifth, also known as the primary triads. We can talk about primary triads as static entities identified as tonic, subdominant, and dominant. Behind this name is a particular function, a role in the drama of music. The tonic is the home, the object of resolve, and generally travels to some kind of predominant chord, such as the subdominant, which function as the shift away from home, as well as the setup for the move to the dominant, while dominant creates the tension, the strong pull back to the tonic. Now let's proceed on how to calculate primary chords in a major scale. Primary chords in a major key are based on the first, fourth, and fifth notes of the major scale. Let's take for example the C major scale, which notes are C, D, E, F, G, A, and B. The notes 1, 4, and 5 there are C, F, and G respectively. To better understand how to calculate the primary chords in a major scale, let's watch this video.
For C major, a very simple key as there are no sharps or flats in the scale. Here's a C major scale, and I'm going to number each note of the scale to help us work out the chords. The primary chords, as we already know, are chords 1, 4, and 5. We use note number 1 as the basis for chord 1, note number 4 as the basis for chord 4, and note number 5 as the basis for chord 5. But let's start by concentrating on chord 1. As we're dealing with chord 1, we take note number 1 from our scale, and I'll pop it over here. This note will now sit at the bottom of chord 1. There are just a couple more steps to follow before we have completed our chord 1. Firstly, we add a note a third above the C. If you're not sure what a third is, then draw a note so that it sits neatly on top of the C like this. Now a handy visual guide is if the bottom note of the chord has a line through it, like the bottom note C, then the note above will also have a line through it. So a third above C is an E. Next, we then add another third immediately above the E. Again, if you're not sure what a third is, then just add a note immediately above, ensuring that it has a line through it when the note below has a line through it. So, a third above the E is G. And that's it, chord 1 completed. Just be aware that it is worth checking that the notes sit neatly on top of each other. We know that the notes C, E, and G make up chord 1 in C major, but if we take a quick detour and look at all of these chords, they all also contain C, E, and G. There are ways you can lay out chords differently. Musicians call these inversions, and I look at these in another video. For the moment, make sure that the notes sit neatly on top of each other. Again, if it helps visually, imagine taking away the stave and making sure that what is left looks like 3 balls balancing on top of each other. You'll see that this is the case for our correct answer, but in all of the wrong answers, it looks like there is a note floating in midair. Make sure your answer has the 3 notes balanced neatly on top of each other. So, chord 1 complete. Chords 4 and 5 follow exactly the same process. For chord 4, we take note number 4, the F, and it sits at the very bottom of our chord. We then add a third above the F. This time the bottom note of our chord is in a space, so we ensure that the note above it also sits in a space. So a third above F is A. Finally, we add a third above the A. Again, the A is in a space, so we add a note in the next space above, the C. If we imagine that the staves are removed, we can see that the notes are sitting neatly on top of each other. Remember, it's always good to check this. This is chord 4. Finally, chord 5. We take note number 5, the G, from our scale, and pop it over here. We add a note a third above. The G has a line through it, so the note above will also have a line through it, the B. And then a third above the B, a D. Therefore, the notes that make up chord 5 in C major are G, B, and D. And here are the primary chords for C major. Now, before you stop watching this video thinking it's as easy as that, there is just one further complication. I mentioned earlier that C major is the simplest key as it has no sharps or flats in its key signature. Well, you do need to be careful with other major keys where sharps and flats are used. Let's calculate the primary chords for G major, a scale which has one sharp in it, an F sharp. Here's the scale of G major, and I've numbered each note of the scale. As before, let's calculate each of the primary chords one by one, so chord 1 first. We take note number 1 as we're looking at chord 1, and I'll pop it over here. We then add a third above the G. As the G has a line through it, so will the third above, the B. We then add a third above the B. It's a D. The notes are sitting neatly on top of each other, so that's our completed chord 1. So, chord 1 was straightforward, and so is chord 4 if we were to work it out. This is chord 4, but I'm going to skip ahead so we can concentrate on chord 5, a chord that can trip up students. Let's have a look at it. As we're dealing with chord 5, we take note number 5, the D, from our scale and pop it over here. Now, if you're wondering why I've put the D under the stave, rather than on the line I've highlighted red, the same place as in the scale at the top of the screen, it doesn't really matter where you place the first note, as long as it is the same letter name or pitch as that in your scale. In this case, the 5th note of G major is a D, so we can put the D wherever we wish. I've chosen to put it under the stave. Okay, by now you will know that the next step is to add a third above the D. So a third above is what note? Well, many students get this wrong and just write an F. It's not, it's an F sharp. Because our G major scale has an F sharp in the scale, in this case the F sharp is placed in the key signature, we must always make sure that any chords in G major use an F sharp rather than just a regular F where necessary. So, and this is really important, whenever you are putting chords together, you must keep a very close eye on the scale you are using. Whenever you add a third above a note, just double check to see if it requires a sharp or flat. Let's keep going with this chord 5. So, we've placed an F sharp on top of the D. We now add a third above the F sharp to complete the chord. The F sharp is in a space, so a third above is an A. Let's just double check that the notes sit neatly on top of each other. They do. Here's our completed chord 5 from G major. Okay, let's look at one final key before we end, D major. Here's our scale, and as ever I've numbered all of the notes. Notice how that there is an F sharp and a C sharp in D major. Therefore, it's really important that in any chord we put together in D major, there will be C sharps instead of Cs and F sharps instead of Fs. Let's look at each of the primary chords one by one. So chord 1 first. As we're dealing with chord 1, we take note number 1, the D, and I'll pop it over here. We now add a third above, F sharp. Remember, it will be an F sharp because the scale of D major has an F sharp in it. We then add a third above the F sharp, an A. An A is just a regular A in D major, so no sharps or flats, so it can stay as an A. Finally, just double check that the notes sit neatly on top of each other. They do. Chord 1 complete. Chord 4, we take note number 4, the G, and we move it to the bottom of our chord. We now add a third above the G. A third above the G is B. In D major, the B is just that, no sharps or flats connected with it. We then add a third above the B, the note D. D is also not sharpened or flattened in D major. The notes are all sitting neatly on top of each other, so this is our completed chord 4. Finally, chord 5, we take note number 5, the A, and we'll pop it over here. A third above the A is which note? C sharp, not a C as in D major, the C's are C sharps. We then add a third above the C sharp, the E. The notes are all sitting neatly on top of each other, so this is our completed chord 5. And here's our full set of primary chords from D major. So, to recap, whenever you are calculating primary chords, always make sure you follow this list of instructions. Firstly, calculate the scale and number each of the notes. Then, notes 1, 4 and 5 of the scale form the basis of chords 1, 4 and 5. You then add a third above the first note, and then another third above the second note. However, whenever you add a third above, always check the scale to see if the notes added require the use of a sharp or flat. For example, if the scale has a B flat in it, any chords which require a B will instead be B flats. And finally, make sure that the notes sit neatly on top of each other.
Good day everyone, I am Carl Kevin Diaz and I will be discussing you primary chords in minor keys. In music theory, the term minor scale refers to the three scale patterns. The first one is the natural minor scale. The second one is the harmonic minor scale and the last one is the melodic minor scale. Makikita natin dito ang tatlong components ng minor keys. Una ay ang C natural minor scale, pangalawa ay ang C harmonic minor scale, at ang pangatlo ang C melodic minor scale. The easiest way to recognize the difference between major and minor keys is to consider the emotion their sounds evoke. Major keys have a bright, happy and cheerful melody, while minor key sounds more melancholy and sad. Sinasabi dito na para mas madali nating malaman kung ito ba ay isang major key o isang minor key, kailangan lang natin damahin ang emosyon na nakapaloob dito. Kasi ang major key ay masaya at masiglang melodiya, samantalang ang minor key naman ay mas malungkot na melodiya. Ang mga halimbawa ng major key ay ang kagaya ng Tala ni Sarah Geronimo, kagaya ng Bumpanes ni Vice Ganda, at marami pang iba. Ang halimbawa naman ng minor keys ay ang Walang Hanggan ni Quest at Huwag Ka Nang Umiyak ni Gary B, at marami pang iba. How to calculate primary chords in minor scale? To form primary chords in a minor key, you need to work with the harmonic minor scale and not the natural minor scale. In other lessons on piano scales, we took a look at the harmonic minor scale. We saw that the seventh note of the harmonic minor scale is raised by a half step. In other words, to form a harmonic minor scale, you take the notes of the natural minor scale and raise the seventh note by a half step. For instance, in the key of a minor, the notes of the natural minor scale are A, B, C, D, F, and G. The notes of the harmonic minor scale are A, B, C, D, E, F, and G sharp. The seventh note, G, has been raised by a half step and is now G sharp. Para makabuo tayo ng primary chords, ang dapat nating gamitin ay ang harmonic minor scale at hindi ang natural minor key kasi magkaiba ang kanilang chords at magkaiba ang kanilang tunog. Magkaiba ang kanilang tunog dahil ang notes ng natural minor scale ay A, B, C, D, F, at G, samantalang ang chords naman ng harmonic scale ay A, B, C, D, E, F, at G sharp. May pagkakalintulad sila ng tunog, pero magkaiba sila. Why do you need to know the harmonic minor scale? It is because one of the primary chords in a minor key, chord fifth, is a major chord. That chord makes use of a note which is not part of the natural minor scale. It is part of the harmonic minor scale in the key of A minor. That chord is E major, whose notes are E, G sharp, and B. G sharp is part of the harmonic minor scale. Dito naman, bakit kailangan nating malaman ang harmonic minor scale? Ito ay dahil sa ang primary chord sa minor key ay isang major chord na gumagamit ng isang nota na hindi kabilang sa natural minor scale. Ito ay ang fifth chord. Ang fifth chord ay kabilang sa minor scale. Importance of primary chords. Primary triads of the 5th, 1st, and 4th degrees are important in music because the strongest chord progressions are usually in fifths. It can also help harmonize hundreds of songs and elastic categories of function.
The screen is our B minor scale, and notice that it is the harmonic version of the B minor scale with the raised 7th, the A sharp. And I've numbered all of the notes. So we'll start with chord 1, and we take note number 1, the B, and pop it over here. We then add a third above the D. Now don't forget to check that the scale uses a D rather than a D sharp or a D flat. It doesn't, so we stick with the D. Finally, we add another third above the D. A third above is F sharp. Don't forget that it is an F sharp, as our scale has an F sharp in it. Do always keep checking that key signature. And that's it, chord 1 complete. Chord 4 next. We take note number 4, as we're dealing with chord 4, and pop it over here. A third above the E is G, and a third above the G is B. Chord 4 complete. Finally, chord 5. We take note number 5, the F sharp, and pop it over here. A third above F sharp is A Sharp. This is where a lot of students trip up when writing chords for minor keys. They are so busy keeping an eye on the key signature, they forget about the raised seventh. This raised seventh is used in any chord which requires it in a minor key. A top tip is that it is only chord 5 of the primary chord that uses the raised seventh, but it is good to get into the habit of checking the entire scale when putting together chords. And to finish off our chord 5, a third above the A sharp is C sharp. Now, there's a lot of sharps here, and although this is a correct answer, this would also be correct. I've written in the key signature of B minor, as is the key we're using, and left the raised seventh, the A sharp, as an accidental. Now, if you're wondering why I can't include the A sharp as part of the key signature, there is a long reason why we can't do this. Have a look at my videos about key signatures if you need to. Now, before we look at another example, just be aware that so far, I've only referred to the primary chords as chords 1, 4 and 5. If you've watched my video on technical names of scale notes, you'll be familiar with the words tonic, subdominant and dominant. These words meaning the first, fourth and fifth notes of the scale respectively. Well, these words can also be applied to chords. So chord 1, which is based on the first note of the scale, or the tonic, can also be called the tonic chord. Or, to be honest, it's the tonic triad, that's probably its more common name. Chord 4, which is based on the fourth note, can be called the subdominant chord, and chord 5, which is based on the fifth note of the scale, can also be called the dominant chord. It doesn't really matter how you refer to a chord in a theory exam. By writing the to represent chord 5, or by writing the dominant chord, means exactly the same thing. However, it's always worth knowing both systems, as musicians, when referring to chords, can often toggle between the two different systems. Let's look at one final key and calculate its primary chords, C minor. Here's the scale, and remember we always use the harmonic version when writing chords. And I've numbered each of the notes of the scale. To calculate the tonic chord, chord 1, we take note number 1 and pop it over here. A third above C is E flat. Remember to keep one eye on that key signature. A third above E flat is G. Chord 1 complete. The subdominant chord, chord 4, next. We take note number 4, the F, and pop it over here. A third above F is A flat. And a third above A flat is C. Chord 4 complete. Finally, the dominant chord, chord 5. We take note number 5, the G, and pop it over here. A third above the G is B what? An eager-eyed student would have one eye on the key signature and spot the B flat, but fail to notice the raised seventh in the scale, turning the B flat into B natural. It's the note in the scale that we use, so it is the B natural which we use in our chord. Now, we don't need to write in the natural in our chord, as we're not using a key signature. However, if you were asked to write your dominant chord with a key signature, this is how it would look so far. 3 flats for the key signature and a natural next to the B. Either way, do remember that you always need to keep one eye on any key signature and always pay attention to that raised seventh. Finally, a third above the B is D. And that's it, our completed primary chords for C minor. So, to recap, firstly, always use the harmonic form of the minor scale to work out the primary chords. Secondly, always keep an eye on the key signature. Watch out for the raised seventh and ensure it is used in any chord which requires it. And as I said earlier, it's only chord 5 of the primary chords which uses the raised seventh. And finally, and this may sound like an obvious piece of advice, but write neatly. Chords can often contain a mixture of sharps and flats, so make sure it's clear what you are